Big political event of the day has not just been about Keir Starmer and his speech on Gaza, but of course Dominic Cummings and Cain, who was the communications chief to Boris Johnson at the COVID inquiry. Isabel Oakeshott is with us now. She is talkTV's international editor. Isabel, I know you've been watching it all morning. What have we learned, do you think?
I found the evidence today actually, frankly, mesmerising. You know, so much of this inquiry has been very dull, and we've had long kind of meandering stuff which doesn't seem to add much to the sum of knowledge. But what we've learned today, a couple of things, I think. First of all, the extraordinary might of the machine that went up against Boris Johnson when he attempted to argue for a different approach to the COVID crisis. So in September 2020, after the first lockdown, and when we'd had a bit of an easier summer, Boris Johnson, we learned today, really did not want to follow the strategy of more national lockdowns. And he'd been taking advice from a number of different voices, including Carl Heneghan, Sunetra Gupta, very eminent scientists that were arguing that actually the best approach was the Swedish approach, where you protect the vulnerable and the very elderly and let everybody else get on. And that was Boris Johnson's instinct, but he was utterly crushed by the number 10 machine and by his medical and scientific advisors, both by the politics and the science there. And he simply was not a strong enough leader to follow his instincts, which personally, I believe probably were the right ones. Many people seeing the full scale of the disastrous collateral damage from long periods of lockdown now think that he should have followed his instincts, but he was not strong enough to do so. We've also learnt of the chaos and confusion in the heart of number 10, particularly at that critical period in March 2020, before the pandemic truly struck the UK. That's a period for which, when I worked with Matt Hancock on his book about the pandemic, I never had access to his private WhatsApp messages. I had access to 100,000 other messages, but not March 2020. He did not share those with me. Now I think I know why, because actually what was going on was total disarray and a ferocious debate about whether or not they should go for so-called herd immunity, i.e. just protecting the vulnerable and letting the virus rip, as critics would say, or whether they should pursue the national lockdown strategy.
Let's just have a quick look at what Dominic Cummings has been saying. He's been talking, he is indeed at this exact moment talking, and if you're watching on talkTV, we have a feed of that which is silent. But let's just look at a little clip of what he said a little bit earlier on to the COVID inquiry.
Due in large part to your own WhatsApps, Mr. Cummings, we're going to have to coarsen our language somewhat.
I apologise.
You called ministers useless pigs, morons, in emails and WhatsApps to your professional colleagues. Do you think you contributed to a lack of effectiveness on the part of ministers and of the cabinet?
No, I think I was reflecting a widespread view amongst competent people at the centre of power at the time about the calibre of a lot of senior people who are dealing with this crisis extremely badly.
Slow down, please, Mr. Cummings. Are you suggesting that your views expressed in those revolting ways were shared by others?
Well, my appalling language is obviously my own, but my judgment of a lot of senior people was widespread.
Do you feel that you expressed your views too trenchantly, that your opinion of ministers and of the cabinet overstated the position?
No, I would say, if anything, it understated the position, as events showed in 2020.
So a bullish Dominic Cummings there under cross-examination by Hugo QC, who is the counsel to the inquiry. This is a sort of slightly off the beaten track point, Isabel, but I found it really patronising when Hugo QC said, could you slow down, could you slow down? He's done that a number of times. Dominic Cummings does speak a little bit quickly, but I can always understand what he's saying. But what he was saying and what he said in those WhatsApps, of course, was withering, including about Matt Hancock calling him a liar at various points. I'm sure Mr. Hancock would deny that.
Well, I agree with your side point. I found that Mr. Hugo the QC's tone, I found it very patronising. It wasn't just once that he said, "Slow down, Mr. Cummings, slow down," in that pompous manner. He said it repeatedly, even when actually Mr. Cummings' evidence was quite clear. Now, there are times, I've listened to it most of the day today, where the evidence from Dominic Cummings is indeed confusing, in particular in relation to March 2020. And I think it's important for people who aren't familiar with Mr. Cummings' modus operandi and his favourite pet themes to understand that he has always considered...
Yeah, this is very on brand, isn't it, Isabel? It's very on brand.
He's always considered everybody apart from himself and a select few, quote, brilliant people to be idiots and morons. But the kind of language that he was using, which we've had to bleep out, I believe, and the BBC has had to issue warnings about, is truly shocking. And you are right that Mr. Hancock, when he gives evidence, will certainly push back on the depiction that Mr. Cummings has given of him as being utterly incompetent and failing to prepare for the pandemic. In fact, Matt Hancock, if I may unusually stand up for him on this occasion, spent much of January and February of 2020 desperately trying to get cabinet colleagues interested in the coming disaster, including in Number 10, and was constantly up against a machine that didn't really want to know and didn't believe that any kind of disaster was imminent. And I'm certain that when it comes to his turn to give evidence, he will give a very different version of events in which he said he was banging his head against a brick wall, trying to get the Prime Minister and those below him interested and engaged in the coming crisis, and couldn't even get them to hold Cobra meetings.
Isabel, thank you very much indeed. That's Isabel Oakeshott, who is talkTV's international editor.